Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm grateful to be with you today. I'm especially excited to have our special guest, Dr. Brian Kaler. He is a fellow Baptist minister. He has a PhD in political communication. He is a former professor of political communication and advocacy studies. He's the president and editor-in-chief of The Word and Way, which is a Missouri Baptist paper, something I know a little bit about. Brian, you've been in this capacity since 2016. He has served in churches with the CBF, SBC, and ABCUSA. He is author and co-author of multiple books. He is an award-winning writer. His work has appeared in the Boston Globe, CNN, Houston Chronicle, and Washington Post. And most importantly, Brian, your work is appearing on my podcast, which I greatly appreciate. Thank you for being here. It was good seeing you in St. Louis. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks. It was good to see you as well after you it'd been a while since you left us in Missouri, but it's good to see you and good to talk with you again.
Well, again, I appreciate your time, and I finished your book, which I greatly enjoyed, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But I was jokingly talking to you before we got started. You tend to talk about the two topics that individually are pretty contentious. You talk about religion and you talk about politics, which is what we're going to do. I wanted to start off by asking you, what was the gravitational pull that got you moving in that direction?
Yeah, the taboo dinner topics right there, and I talk about them together. And so I do often joke that it makes me a horrible dinner guest, although some people think I'm a great dinner guest.
It makes for short conversations, probably.
That's right. I mean, I've always been engaged and interested in both areas, not necessarily always together, but separately. I grew up in the church and was very active, and also had an early interest in politics. I remember as a 7-year-old on election night, my own red and blue map that I was coloring in as the states were being called in the presidential election. And so I've always had that interest. In graduate school is when I really particularly began to look at the intersection of faith and politics. By that point, I had felt a call to ministry. I had served as a pastoral intern at a church you later served as pastor of. We were there at different times, but I also realized that my ministry wasn't to be direct pastoral. And so I'm in graduate school working on a PhD in political communication, first a master's and then a PhD. And while the focus was political communication as the program, what I was studying was religion and politics. I was looking at religious rhetoric and presidential campaigns. I was looking at how churches, how denominations were addressing and talking about political issues. So that intersection there. So, there's a lot that we do really poorly when it comes about religion and politics, particularly when we put them together. And so that's given me a lot to study and to write about.
Listen, I think our paths are somewhat similar. You mentioned the church that we were there at different times. But in terms of your education, and I don't know if I heard this on another interview you did, but is there any truth to your, I guess, politely being invited out of a seminary
Yeah.
because of something you did?
Yeah. I was kicked out of Southern Baptist Seminary because I wrote a paper arguing that women should be allowed to be pastors, and it caused a much bigger turmoil on campus than I had anticipated. Although I was doing it knowing that I was gonna stir things up a little bit, but it was much more successful than I anticipated. I was already gonna leave, but it left more dramatically.
Well, that was kind of like spiking the football in the end zone. Apparently, on your way out. Yeah. Well, let me start off by this. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, around 1980, I remember he famously appeared to the Southern Baptist Convention and said, "I know you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you." And of course, they went crazy with applause when that happened. I want to tie that into the recent decision of the Internal Revenue Service, which they more or less responded to a lawsuit and said, we're not going to enforce the Johnson Amendment. And you could make a case they weren't doing that to begin with. But I was going to ask you, what kind of impact, if at all, do you think that's going to have on pastors and churches as far as endorsing candidates?
Yeah, I do fear that the new move, which I know you've talked about on an episode already, I do fear that that's going to encourage more churches to engage in partisan politics and encourage more pastors to endorse candidates from the pulpit or maybe in bulletins and other church writings. The IRS had not been really enforcing the rule, and that was a problem. I think it's a good rule. I think tax exempt organizations should not be engaging in partisan politics. If you want to engage in partisan politics, you should pay tax on the money that you're spending in politics. And so this is a rule that has applied generically to all C3 organizations. But while the IRS wasn't enforcing on houses of worship, it's even worse what Trump is doing now and what the IRS is doing under his control, because what they're basically saying is, not only are we not going to enforce it, wink wink, but we're going to say it should be over. We're going to encourage you to actually endorse. And so that active push The news attention around this means that there's going to be a lot more people that are looking, hey, how can we get engaged? How can we get a local church to get engaged? I could see a lot of pressures on pastors. I really worry about the impact this is going to have on pastors. I could see a deacon or an elder or, a big donor in the congregation coming to the pastor and saying, hey, I really think you should endorse this city council member or this state representative candidate, and putting pressure because of their position or their money that they give to the church. Or, what's going to happen if, you as a pastor have multiple people in your congregation and they want you to endorse different candidates in the same race. I mean, the divide that this is going to bring into our congregations, I think is dangerous and damaging. And it really could see a flood of dark political money, because political activists are going to think, I could spend all of this money on political campaigns, but if I funnel it through a church, I don't have to pay taxes on it. And now I can spend even more money. And it's going to take us away from our mission, from our focus. We're not here to serve any particular political candidate.
Yeah.
And so I'm really concerned about this move.
Well, of course, pastors and churches can resist that urge, which is what I intend to do. But I thought it was a good segue into the book that you and Bo co-authored. Can you tell us a little bit about who Bo is?
Yeah, sure. Bo Underwood is a friend of mine for several years, and then he was a local pastor in Jefferson City, Missouri, where I live. And then he started writing with me at Word and Way first for several years before we wrote the book together. He's now a pastor in Christian Church Disciples of Christ denomination in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we continue to talk all the time and work and write together.
Well, as a pastor, of course, we're both Baptist, and when you think about baptism, that's in the DNA of being a Baptist. But the title, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism, I was trying to look at the metaphor of baptism, because I think about making disciples and conversion. Is that the intention that you had?
Yeah, it really was this idea of thinking about this changing the nature of America. America was founded with a separation of church and state, which was a radical experiment that, our Baptist, forefathers, foremothers had pushed for. And it's one of the reasons why we have this unique experiment. But we saw some significant shifts. There's been waves of Christian nationalism throughout our history. We're in one right now, a kind of a violent wave of Christian nationalists with conservative evangelicals and Pentecostals. But in Baptizing America, we look at kind of the post-World War II era, which was the last big wave. And so this idea of changing the nature of America. So we had a number of things happen in the late 40s, throughout the 50s and early 60s. Under God goes in the Pledge of Allegiance, and God We Trust becomes the national motto. We've got the creation of the National Prayer Breakfast. All these things are happening that kind of change the nature of America. So that's this idea of kind of like a baptizing or a conversion experience. And I also drew the metaphor with this idea from Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's one of the two main presidents in the book, along with Harry Truman. And Dwight Eisenhower starts his inaugural address actually with a prayer, which was a significant kind of shift from presidential tradition and is in itself kind of a marker of what he would do in his administration. And then just over a week later, he goes and gets baptized in a Presbyterian church in D.C., the only president who's been baptized in office. And so that seemed to be a marker or a metaphor for what he was about to do to the nation as well.
Well, you mentioned the Mainline, and I was going to ask you, could you define what you mean by, we get to blame the Mainline for this. It's not our fault this time. But can you talk about, when you talk about mainline Protestantism, what are you talking about, or who are you talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of a couple ways of defining the mainline. One, you have kind of the historic seven sisters, which were the seven denominations throughout American history that were the dominant until the late 60s, early 70s. That would include American Baptist Churches USA, the Episcopal Church, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which Bo is a minister in, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is always kind of a confusing one because they have the word evangelical in their name, but they're actually mainline in that regard. You got the United Church of Christ and the Presbyterian Church USA. And so these are churches. Another way of thinking about mainline, though, beyond those, is churches that are more ecumenically minded, denominations that are more ecumenically minded. These have also been denominations that were leading the way compared to evangelicals on race relations, and that's actually part of why we see a move in the 60s and 70s away from mainline churches into evangelical churches, as some of that was a white lash, a response to the mainline church. Joining the civil rights movement and so forth. I hate to break it to you a little bit, but sociologists now do classify the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship now as a mainline denomination.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that.
And I think it's an interesting shift. I think when, CBF started coming out of Southern Baptist Life, we were very much evangelical. Southern Baptists are still marked that way. I think it's an interesting shift. I think it's an accurate designation that sometime over the last 35 years, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Baptist have moved to be more ecumenical, more engaged in racial justice, more like a mainline congregation, and less like a traditional evangelical situation.
Yeah, I gotcha. Listen, I found the reference to Andrew Whitehead pretty helpful. Talked about the underpinnings of Christian nationalism, and he mentioned power, fear, and violence. And I was going to ask you, and you may have mentioned this, are there soft and hard versions of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Andrew Whitehead's book, American Idolatry, is an excellent book on thinking about like these idols of Christian nationalism. And also the work that Andrew does with Samuel Perry and other sociologists, I think is really helpful in answering your question, because they never define Christian nationalism as either you're a Christian nationalist or you're not, right? It's them versus us type of situation. Instead, Christian nationalism is always defined on a continuum. And so to determine where someone fits, they ask usually 6 or 7 different questions. And then based on that, people kind of get ranked on the continuum. And so what that shows is, while there are some people that are hardcore Christian nationalists, they're saying yes to all of the questions, they're storming the Capitol while carrying Christian flags kind of moment, right? Most Americans are somewhere in the middle. So the majority of Americans like some Christian nationalism, don't like all Christian nationalism. And so that we would get that kind of softer, fuzzier, cuddlier, less violent version of Christian nationalism. And so the question then is, how do we all, wherever we are on that spectrum, how do we all detox a little bit? Like, how do we move away from Christian nationalism? Because I really do think it's a heresy as well as being dangerous to our pluralistic democracy. So how do we find ways of separating the American from the gospel, the chaff from the wheat? Because in the white evangelical, white mainline, white Catholic church, really just white Christian church in America, for generations, we've mixed American and Christian identities as if they were synonymous.
Gotcha.
And so all of us have to kind of learn how to deculturalize our faith.
Well, in the course of the book, you were mentioning that mainline Protestants brought the church to the state, and then the state came to the church. I kind of want to go through some of the greatest hits, I suppose, of Christian nationalism, and because you alluded to some of them. And I wanted to start with the topic of prayer. And as I was reading, like I say, in one of the chapters on prayer, the National Day of Prayer was 1952, and then the National Prayer Breakfast followed after that, and then you had to move towards prayer in the public schools or state-sponsored prayer. So I guess I'm asking, even decades ago, there was this movement to quote-unquote return us to God. What was going on in the 50s? The mechanism for all this?
Yeah, it was that Cold War. War and Christian nationalism go together. A very symbiotic relationship. War inspires Christian nationalism, and Christian nationalism tends to rally people to support war. And so the Cold War particularly seems to inspire Christian nationalism in the 50s, I think because of the atheistic nature of the Soviet Union, right? And so this was a way of like marking ourselves as we are different than them because we are the Christians. And if we can invoke God, if we can somehow conjure God up on our side, then that will guarantee a win in this war. That seems to be a lot of the driving impetus, and we hear that in the rhetoric. The key pastor, who's the leader, the real reason why Under God goes in the Pledge of Allegiance, for instance, actually even says that in his sermon when Dwight D. Eisenhower is listening in the church. He talks about this being a theological battle, the Cold War, between the United States and the atheistic, godless communists. And so that's why we needed to put God in our Pledge of Allegiance, to prove that we were on God's side and therefore God was on our side and therefore we would win. And so that seems to be that fear of the other, that fear of the communists, that seems to be driving a lot of the Christian nationalism in that.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting, similarly with the national motto, "In God We Trust." Could you say this loosely was a Southern thing? Was it related to, am I reading this right, the Civil War and the Confederacy?
Well, yeah, but although we do have to put blame on both sides. So unlike the United States, the Confederate States of America were founded as a Christian nation, if you will. I mean, maybe we should put Christian in quote marks, but like in their Constitution, the Confederate States put Jesus there in the preamble, right at the beginning. And so that same like attitude that we seem to have during the Cold War, we see among some Northerners in the Civil War. They're worried. Oh no, the Confederates put Jesus in the Constitution. Does that mean God will be on their side? And so we need to do something. So there was a push actually to put God in the U.S. Constitution. And then there was also a push by some Pennsylvania, primarily Christians, to put "In God We Trust" on our coins. At that point, it was just our coins. It was in the 50s that we then put it on our paper currency as well. So yeah, it has its roots in that Civil War. Again, this theological battle of, we can somehow conjure God up on our side, as if it works that way, right? As if we can just, stamp God's name on some coins or put God's name in the Constitution, therefore God will defend us no matter what. I mean, that didn't work even for ancient Israel in the Bible. I don't know why we thought it would work for us.
Well, that was an interesting, and I'm not sure this is an exact quote, Brian, but in the book, it says, "Far from keeping God in society, in God we trust, government kicked religion out of God," which I thought was a nice turn of a phrase. But does that have something to do with the corruption of something sacred with something secular?
Yeah, and what's happened the reason why we make that argument is that we've kicked, God we've kicked religion out of God is that's how the courts have justified things like "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance and "In God We Trust" as the national motto, is that it's a generic statement of Americanism, right? And so it's no longer a deep theological statement. It's no longer a sectarian statement. And so what they're saying is, "Under God" isn't sectarian. So then who is this God that the state is asking me to pledge allegiance to? It's some generic American God, as opposed to, the God that we actually worship and follow in church and in our lives. And so that's what's happened is this, it's one or the other. Like either it's a sectarian statement and thus it's unconstitutional, or it's some generic statement at which point it's using the Lord's name in vain.
Well, we talk about Christian nationalism, obviously, but there was another phrase called civil religion. Are those synonymous, Brian, or is there some differences?
Yeah, so we make the argument in the book, and this is probably one of the more controversial things that we pushed on, is that they really are synonymous. That what we often dismissed as merely civil religion, harmless mixing of church and state, these generic God references, like "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, like "In God We Trust" in the national model, actually turned out to be Christian nationalism. Maybe a friendlier, cuddlier, softer version of Christian nationalism, not a violent version, but it's kind of the gateway drug to what we're dealing with today. And so that's our argument, is that civil religion actually turns out not to be harmless. It turns out to be a form of Christian nationalism.
Okay. And you mentioned the phrase "one nation under God," and the Pledge of Allegiance, did that come about as a result of trying to sell American flags? Or am I oversimplifying it a little bit?
No, that really is it. By a Baptist socialist minister. I don't know if you've ever been called a socialist, but we don't normally put those two words together. I've been called a Marxist pastor by Roger Stone when he was criticizing me. But Francis Bellamy was an American Baptist pastor in New England and also a Christian socialist. He used that term for himself. It's actually why he got fired from his Baptist church. You can probably imagine that, because he was preaching socialism and the church didn't necessarily agree with that. So he's writing for a magazine that funds itself by selling American flags. And so they thought a fundraising effort to help the magazine would be, well, if there was a pledge that people said to the flag, then maybe more people would buy a flag and thus help sell them, keep the magazine in business. So he writes the Pledge of Allegiance, but he leaves God out of it, which is fascinating to think that the Baptist minister doesn't put God in it. And so it stays a godless pledge for over 60 years until we get to 1954. Cold War, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a Presbyterian pastor makes this case in a sermon to Eisenhower that we need to put "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance to make sure that we win this theological battle against the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, one of the other greatest hits, and I haven't ranked these polls come out weekly or monthly, but America is a Christian nation. You call that a myth in the book, and I was going to ask you, what do you mean? Because this seems to be the heart, or at the heart, of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, it is. Like, it's funny. People who wanted us to be a Christian nation at the time of our founding attacked the Constitution. They called it godless. They wanted us to be a Christian nation. The only religious reference in the Constitution originally, before any of the amendments, before we get the First Amendment on religion, is Article 6, the prohibition on religious tests for office, which is a very anti-Christian nationalism thing, that anybody can serve even if they're an atheist. And there were actually a number of the colonies that had laws barring atheists from serving in office, and our founders took a different tact. And so we had this debate. There were some people, John Adams, Patrick Henry, there were some of the founders that wanted us to be a Christian nation. But Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, to some degree George Washington, pushed back against that and founded us in a unique experiment separating church and state and not as a Christian nation.
Well, Brian, didn't Jefferson have, quote unquote, his own Bible? I mean, the Jefferson Bible.
Right, then he cut out all the miracles.
I see you smiling there. I had to get that
Yeah.
in. I mentioned that to our people, and they received it well, but this is all part of the dynamic of this phrase, right?
It is. I mean, that's the irony, right? Jefferson would be considered a heretic in like any church today. I mean, he's literally cutting out all the miracles. I have the Jefferson Bible on my bookshelf. He's cutting out all the miracles. He doesn't believe in Jesus's, divinity and the miracles and all of that. And so, of course, he wants a separation of church and state. He's not trying to create a Christian nation.
Well, let's talk about this now, the separation of church and state, and I want to get a reference to Buddy Sheridan and the Four Fragile Freedoms every chance I get. Did I read this correctly, that at the intersection of church and state, we find St. John's Episcopal Church and the Washington National Cathedral? And it seems to me that using those references... Well, let me back up. What did you mean by that? What is that about?
Yeah, and so this is really interesting. We wrote the book, and we finished it up primarily, fall of 23, and we did a few edits in early 24. It came out later that year, and it's been fascinating because since the book came out, Trump won, the election and came back into office, and then we had inaugural services as usual at both St. John's Episcopal Church right across the street from the White House and at the National Cathedral, another Episcopal congregation in D.C. And in some ways, especially the National Cathedral, because of Bishop Buddy's sermon where she pleaded with the president to show mercy on LGBTQ children and undocumented migrants, that a lot of people have kind of held up this kind of like progressive resistance to the Trump administration. And yet at the same time, there's also still a lot of Christian nationalism embedded in both of those churches and even in the National Cathedral service. So while Bishop Buddy's sermon was really good, the rest of the service was full of Christian nationalism. And so, we haven't, even in modern progressive spaces and even in mainline Protestant spaces, haven't found a way to completely detox from Christian nationalism. Yeah. And so I think that's a really significant problem that a lot of churches need to deal with, and also we think need to do some repentance on too. Like, how do we repent for the ways that we've pushed Christian nationalism?
Right, this was the part of the book that I found irritating, and I'll use this in a good way.
Everyone has to find one part of the book irritating.
No,
so
I'm not limiting the one thing, but the section on worshiping America. What's the issue with singing "God of Our Fathers, America the Beautiful"? My country 'tis of thee, because it's all in the hymnal.
Yeah, I think we should rip those pages out of the hymnal, but that's part of my problem, right? The critique that I have is that we put these in the hymnals. I went through all the denominational hymnals for this section of the book, and one thing I'd say I did enjoy doing this is I also critique our publisher. Chalice Press is the Christian Church Disciples of Christ publishing house, and they have published hymnals, and so we critiqued their hymnals as well for having these patriotic songs in there. And I think part of it is, I do think for the most part, the hymns are kind of the softer version of Christian nationalism. Yeah. With the exception that Battle Hymn of the Republic gets a little bit further, I'd say. And then also the national anthem, which is in several of the hymnals as well. That just doesn't seem to have any place in there as well. That's not intended to be a religious song at all. Battle Hymn of the Republic conflates the death of soldiers with the death of Jesus. And I think we can honor those who have served without putting their death on the same level Jesus' death, right? So that's theologically, it gets pretty messy there. But even outside of those two, the others are a soft version of Christian nationalism. But what I'm concerned is that because we have spent generations leading people to see their American citizenship and their Christian faith as synonymous, these hymns and the special services around Memorial Day and Veterans Day, and especially the high holy day of Christian nationalism, the 4th of July, when we're singing these songs, we have helped people think that American and Christian identities go hand in hand. And so I think we need to stop doing that so that we can help ourselves recognize that we are Christians first. And that might mean at times that it will mean at times that we're going to have to critique our nation, and that we can be patriotic without being nationalistic.
Well, in the Book of Common Prayer, there are prayers for government officials and judges. And aren't we supposed to be doing that, to pray for your leaders and to be calling our church to pray for our leaders? And also with the songs, Brian, and I want to talk about the flag here in a second. But for those who I've spoken to folks about this, we do live in the United States. Is there a way of doing this with the understanding that we are grateful for our nation, but also recognizing that our citizenship is in heaven.
Yeah, so this what I'm going to offer as an answer here isn't in the book, but my favorite way of thinking about this actually comes from Tony Campolo. And several years ago, Chris just passed away last year. He was giving a sermon, and he was talking about the temptation that we all face, that no matter where we live, the temptation is to make our own nation, the promised land, the kingdom of, the new Israel, right? And that the lesson of Revelation is instead to assume that our nation is a Babylon, right? That it's in competition with the kingdom of heaven. But then he goes on to joke, like, look, I love being in America. I think it's the greatest Babylon on the face of the earth, but it's still Babylon. Yeah. And I think that's the attitude that's missing in those patriotic hymns and in a lot of the Book of Common Prayer, which doesn't just pray for judges and governors and presidents, but also includes language that lifts up the nation itself as well. And so the question is, how do we pray for those in authority without, again, treating our nation as the greatest nation, and instead recognizing the temptation of falling into the trap of the ways of Babylon?
Well, let's talk about flags in the sanctuary. And to my knowledge, in the churches that I've served, and fortunately with the exception of this one, there have always been American flags in the sanctuary, and sometimes you'd even have a Christian flag. How did that get started?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really important for all churches, if they have a flag, to try to determine when it showed up, because it probably wasn't at the beginning, because it probably happened during war. There's a few churches that had something during the Civil War, but flag culture wasn't really a thing back then. During World War I, we see some of our German Lutheran immigrant communities are putting up a flag to prove that they're loyal to the United States and not to Germany. But primarily it's World War II. That's when most of the flags in churches across the country show up, either outside on a flagpole, or what I think is even worse is inside the sanctuary. And so, knowing why it showed up should also give us pause. Well, was this just to support a war? Is that really what we're called to be doing here as we worship the Prince of Peace? And so I think that's a good question, a starting point of when did it show up?
Well, I know Baptists are autonomous, of course, one of our favorite words. But I was curious, I guess each church handles this issue with the placement of flags or not, or using it at various times throughout the year. Is there a position that other denominations take on this when they inform their local churches?
Yeah, so we do find a few denominational statements. The U.S. Catholic bishops have encouraged against the use of any national symbols in the sanctuary. They're kind of agnostic about it elsewhere on a campus, but in the sanctuary itself, we should only have symbols that are leading us towards worship of God. The United Methodist Church has discouraged the use of flags in the sanctuary, although at the same time, most United Methodist churches have a flag in the sanctuary. Right? So it's not a binding rule, but it's one that's not being followed. There's been some Episcopal groups, the Episcopal Bishop of Missouri, actually, just a couple months ago, put out a statement arguing that churches should not have a flag in the sanctuary. And there was at least one congregation that invited him to come and have a dialogue. And then they moved, because of the conversation, they actually moved the flag out of the sanctuary. Initially, they were resistant to his, kind of pastoral advice to them, but they came to see that. So, yeah, obviously with Baptists, we don't have that kind of declaration. Every church is going to make their own decision. But I think it's important to think very theologically about anything we're putting in the sanctuary.
Gotcha. Well, we're kind of in the home stretch here, and I was going to talk about the issue of separation of church and state, and this might have come out of the book. Is the wall of separation of church and state strong and tall enough to fend off Christian nationalism, you think?
Well, I think it is the antidote to Christian nationalism. So if we have a strong separation of church and state, then Christian nationalism cannot be implemented. Right? They cannot actually do the things they want to do in government. At the moment, though, I think there's too many holes and chips at the wall. That's why we're at a very critical juncture, that we need to do more work to shore up the separation of church and state, because Christian nationalism is making a lot of headways in, not just in D.C., but also, in a lot of states. Like Missouri and Tennessee and Florida and Texas and Arkansas, like a number of states, we're seeing that we're moving backwards when it comes to becoming more Christian nationalist and less of a separation.
And of course, there are a number of reasons or obstacles to notice as far as Christian nationalism is concerned, but do you find reason for optimism? As we look at this subject, you talk about the different waves, and where do you see the role of the church and church leadership? Where would you like to see them?
Yeah, asking me for optimism or hopefulness, I often joke when I asked a question about, do I have hope And I joke a lot of times, because it's mostly true, that if you find anything hopeful or, particularly pastoral in the book, that Bo probably wrote that section.
Well, that's not all bad, Brian.
I think that's why we complement each other well, right? He offers some
Yeah,
hope, and then,
yeah.
I offer the dark, horrible truth. We have had a lot of conversations since the book has come out. It's been out, right at a year now, and a lot of conversations in churches. Sunday schools are using it and having conversations and dialogue. And that makes me really excited to see that people are tackling the issue of Christian nationalism. There was actually a Pew survey last year that said that half of Americans said they were not familiar with the concept of Christian nationalism, which I find pretty stunning considering how much attention it has received. And so it's really good that we're having these conversations, because information, knowledge, learning about it is the first step. That's why I'm thankful that you're having this conversation, so that your listeners can learn a little bit more about Christian nationalism, because this is the first step to being able to kind of stand up against what I think is a heresy done in our name, but a heresy and a threat to our country. And so that does give me hope that people are paying attention, that people are starting to think about it and find ways to push back.
Well, I like what you said towards the end of the book, and it was somewhat hopeful, so this could have been Bo who have written this. But what did you mean by, and this is what I liked about the book, because when you read about Christian nationalism, of course, there are other books on Christian nationalism, it seems to me there was an effort to be fair-minded to say that Christian nationalism, there are these waves. There is a hard version and a soft version, and it's not necessarily identifiable with one specific political party all the time. But what did you mean by saying it's important for us to notice the speck in someone else's eye, but not notice the plank in our own eye as it relates to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, that's what was kind of a guiding impetus actually for the book, was this idea of seeing all of the criticism, well-deserved, of conservative evangelicals for pushing Christian nationalism coming from mainline and progressive Christians who were either unaware or unobservant of their own Christian nationalism in their own churches and in their own denominations. And so, I mean, that concept of, wait a minute, we've been criticizing them, and as we keep doing research, everything that the evidence that we see people pointing to suggest that we were a Christian nation were things that mainline Protestants actually created. And so we need to make sure that we start with ourselves. And maybe that's also where we can be most successful, right? I mean, Robert Jeffress at First Baptist Church of Dallas, which is probably one of the most Christian nationalist churches in the country, they're not going to study baptizing America. They're not going to invite me to come speak. They don't care what I have to say. But there are people in my church that care what I have to say, and people in your church that will care what you have to say, right? So we can start in our own areas, and if we can detox and move our own communities away from Christian nationalism, then we can take this really big problem. It seems like unsurmountable at a national level, but we can make some real progress in churches and denominations that are willing to do the hard work and to move away from Christian nationalism. And so it's not just this idea of not being hypocritical, but it's also like, hey, this is actually the area where we can get something done as well.
I think one of my favorite references when I think about church and state is George W. Truman's sermon in 1920 when he was on the steps of the
Capitol.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, and he was talking about the words of Jesus about rendering the things to Caesar that are Caesar's, and the things to God that are the things of God. Would that be, if we were to try to put a bow on this, would that still be a good mindset to have as we think about the relationships between church and state?
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's what we've always struggled on, is where to draw that line, right? But I think the understanding, our citizenship in the kingdom of God first and foremost is important, and that we already have a savior. He's not going to be found in DC. That's not, that's the way that we save the world. The way that we bring the good news isn't by taking over power. It isn't by, winning elections. It's always been an upside down gospel that works, through the weak and not through, the ways of Caesar.
That's a good word to end on. Let me get you out of here on this, because I want our people to know about the Word and Way. And how would people be able to follow you or to get access to the Word and Way and some of your writings?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that opportunity. So, our main site is wordandway.org, spelling out the and, wordandway.org. If people are particularly interested in thinking about Christian nationalism and the intersection of, faith and culture and politics, our email newsletter, A Public Witness, is the kind of the key platform to follow us there. I write there a couple times a week, long form pieces and that's publicwitness.wordandway.org. Our podcast is Dangerous Dogma that you can find on any podcast forum.
That rolls off the tongue, Brian.
I know, it does. It sounds good. I like it. We're challenging the dangerous dogmas, the dangerous ways that Christianity is misused, but also recognizing that if we follow the ways of Jesus, that they're actually pretty dangerous themselves. And so, yeah, there's a number of ways that people can engage.
Well, Brian, it's been great seeing you again and listening to you. You've been listening to Dr. Brian Kaler. The book is Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. And until next time, thanks for listening.